He was physically very punishing with the victims, beating them, abusing them, and eventually murdering them. Manipulative, controlling, domineering, and astute enough to get away with this for a long enough period of time. He is our worst nightmare.
Welcome to Very Scary People. I'm Donnie Wahlberg. From May 1987 to April 1992, there were a series of rapes, abductions, and murders of young women just north of the U.S.-Canadian border. Authorities from several cities in Ontario and FBI profilers from the United States joined forces to try and capture those responsible for the vicious attacks. Who was behind these horrific crimes? No one could have imagined how disturbing the answer would be. Here's part one of the Ken and Barbie Killers.
The city of Toronto sits on the north shore of Lake Ontario. And Scarborough is on the eastern edge of the city. It's not an unsafe place. And that's what made the fact that you had a serial rapist running around the eastern end of the city so concerning.
The Scarborough attacks permeated the media. Everyone heard about it. Everyone knew.
Police have been tracking the movement of this serial rapist. The man has targeted young women walking alone at night at various locations throughout Scarborough.
Women were walking home, getting off a bus late at night, and they were getting attacked, all in that one area of the city, and that part of the city became like a forbidden zone to travel at night.
Nobody could understand, how is this person doing this time and time again?
He attacked all his victims from behind, and none of them really got a good look at his face at all. They just knew generally that he was mid-20s, sort of blonde hair, white male, and he was just getting away with it.
Our fear was if he wasn't stopped soon, that this is going to escalate to murder.
It was the Thursday before the Easter long weekend. 15-year-old Kristen French was walking home from school.
And she didn't live more than a few blocks away from her school.
And she passed by a church. There was a parking lot in front, and there was a car parked there, and there was this woman. She had a big road map on the hood, and she was all fluttered, and she was trying to find the street, and she couldn't find it, and she saw Kristen walking by, and she asked her for help.
And says, "We're lost, can you show us where to go?"
Kristen French, being just a decent gal, came over to help this woman. While she was helping her find the street, the man dragged her into the car,
push her into the back seat, and away they go.
Kristen would normally come home right after school and let the dog out.
She was the kind of person that if she said she was going to be home at a certain hour, she was going to be home at that hour. And if she wasn't, she would call and let you know why she wasn't going to be home.
The mom had called home from work to talk to her. She wasn't home. So the day that she disappeared struck them as unusual right away.
And they were very worried, and they were calling around. They thought maybe she'd gone to someone's home, but they knew in their heart of hearts this was not their daughter's routine.
Just based on the nature of Kristen French and her dependability, her disappearance was immediately reported to police.
This is 15-year-old Kristen Dawn French. She's 5'5", weighs 110 pounds, with brown hair and brown eyes. She was last seen wearing her school uniform of a green plaid skirt with a green V-neck sweater. She was also wearing a black leather jacket.
Kristen grew up in St. Catharines, and she, by all accounts, was a very popular straight-A student.
The first place I went to was St. Catharines, where I interviewed the French family for the syndicated show A Current Affair. and it was gut-wrenching. The life had been drained from them.
It's such a hopeless feeling sitting at home, knowing that the possibility that your daughter is going through something just horrific and you can't do a thing to stop it.
Kristen was, they called her Christy, and she was the perfect daughter. She was punctual and dependable, reliable, responsible. She was a figure skater. She rode for her high school.
She was from a big family. It was a second marriage for her parents, so she had older brothers and sisters, but they were all very close. And I believe she'd had her first boyfriend, and she was excited because I believe one of her siblings was getting married soon.
The French's home was full of photographs on the mantels and on the shelves of Kristen French. Beautiful girl, tall, dark hair, you know, seemingly having life in front of her, which made those photographs more poignant and even sadder than, you know, you could ever imagine.
If anybody's seen my daughter, Kristen French, I'd like to phone the Niagara police as quickly as possible.
The abduction of Kristen French was a major case in Canada. This is broad daylight. She's walking home from school. It's in the afternoon in a populated area that we had eyewitnesses.
A witness came forward to say she had been driving by the church parking lot, looked over her shoulder, and saw what she thought were kids fooling around. And they were kind of pushing back and forth, and someone got pushed into the car, but she thought about it for a second, like, oh, that's odd. Then she said, oh, it's probably just teenagers goofing around, and she kept going.
And it's just so tragic that no one knew what was really happening.
So as soon as she had heard that Kristen was missing, the woman who had seen the incident at the car called police.
When police were searching for clues regarding the disappearance of Kristen French, they found a very crucial piece of evidence. They found her shoe in the parking lot of the church.
A sign of the struggle there. When they forced her into the car, it was identified for sure as her, and there's no question as to who the victim was.
Her shoe was found, suggesting she struggled with her abductor before being pulled into a car.
I know it's cliche, but it was the parents' worst nightmare.
We just want her back.
"15-year-old Kristen French was apparently abducted in broad daylight from a church parking lot on Thursday, less than a kilometer from home.
Kristen French had been abducted in St. Catharines while walking home from school. She had been sort of lured into a parking lot of this Grace Lutheran church. Stranger-based abduction in broad daylight, a very high-risk offense.
Police made the deduction based on forensic evidence, a shoe, and part of a makeup kit that could have been lost as Kristen struggled with her abductor.
She was resisting, fighting, shoving her in the back of the car, and the car took off at a high rate of speed.
And based on what police call a solid witness account, they're also looking for a car similar to this, a 1982 or newer Camaro or Firebird, off-white or cream in color.
It seemed that the best information was that the person or people who had taken Kristen French were in a cream-colored Camaro or similar car. And there were billboards even in our community. There was a huge appeal. Have you seen this car?
They talked to a lot of witnesses. They thought it was some kind of a Camaro, and it turned out it was not that car.
And the police, having so little to go on, could only place their faith in what witnesses had seen.
When Kristen was kidnapped, it was Easter weekend, and almost right away there were massive searches arranged for Kristen French that started on the Friday and lasted through the entire weekend.
As many as 2,000 people gathered to help search the north end of St. Catharines for clues to Kristen's whereabouts.
I joined the search for Kristen French. I remember we did sort of a systematic line search, and we all walked sort of a line and spread out to make sure that we covered all the areas. There was always that glimmer of hope that you would find something.
There was this tremendous feeling in the community of wishing to do something helpful because it was so unlikely.
For someone to be grabbed off the street in the middle of the day, a young person walking home from school, it just doesn't happen. It really doesn't happen, especially in St. Catharines at that time.
St. Catharines is a quaint, sleepy little town between Toronto and Niagara Falls. It's known for its wine country, and it's just a beautiful little town.
It's also the home to this lovely couple, Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka.
Hi, Karla.
Hi.
Say hi for the camera.
Hi, camera. Look at me, come here.
Oh, focus in on Karla.
Come here.
Isn't she beautiful?
Come here.
Karla Homolka grew up in St. Catharines with her parents and two sisters.
She had a sister, Tammy and Lori. Tammy was the youngest.
Karla loved animals, worked at pet stores, and then at a vet clinic.
She wanted to be a veterinarian. She had a love of animals. One of her friends told me when they went out camping one time, there was a bug sort of crawling in their tent, and rather than stomping it with a shoe, she picked it up gently and took it outside because she couldn't imagine doing anything else to this little bug.
But she did have this little bit of a wild streak. She sort of craved less boredom, a little more activity in her life, a little more excitement in her life.
And, she was pretty focused on getting a boyfriend and getting married. And she had some close girlfriends who spent a lot of time, dreaming about the day they were going to get married. They had what they called the Diamond Club, which was talking about the diamond rings they hoped to get for their engagement.
She had a path in life, and she was going to stick to that path. Whatever she had to do, she was going to do.
Karla did have relationships in high school, but it wasn't really until she met Paul Bernardo that things really changed for Karla.
Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka met in a hotel lobby in Scarborough. I believe she was 17, he was 23, and she was in Scarborough for a pet food convention because she worked at a pet store as a teenager. And he and some friends had showed up at the lobby of the hotel late at night to hit the 24-hour restaurant, and she came down with one of her friends.
They're in their pajamas, and they decide they're going to go down to the Howard Johnson restaurant for apple pie and coffee.
And in walks Bernardo with a friend, and the two of them seem to just hit it off.
And the next thing you know is they've all adjourned to the girl's room, and from that point on, it was pretty hot and heavy romance.
And as she said, he was the perfect man for me. He was the man of my dreams. This is the man I want to marry.
They seemed like the ideal couple. They got engaged at Niagara Falls, and I think she thought she had her happy ever after.
There she is, ladies and gentlemen, the sexiest girl in the world.
And they started going out to St. Catharines a lot and spending more time in St. Catharines. And that was where Kristen French was abducted.
Kristen French's parents remain in seclusion, surrounded by family and friends, desperate for any news of their daughter.
By Sunday, I believe it was, Kristen's father went on TV and made an appeal for his daughter, and it is so emotional.
Kristen, if you can hear or read this, you want to know that we are thinking of you and that everything can be done is being done.
They said to her, just know that we will always be looking for you, no matter what happens. As a mom, boy, that really hits home.
And it was absolutely heartbreaking, but more so knowing that Kristen was alive and she was watching it.
It is a quiet, peaceful city by the lake. But look below the surface, and there is a ripple of fear.
Kristen French was popular, social, from a loving home, and in broad daylight, she was taken.
The 15-year-old honors student disappeared last Thursday on her way home from school. Police believe she was abducted, likely in the parking lot of this nearby church.
There was this collective realization that something terrible is in our midst.
Violent crime had been escalating before Kristen French's abduction, really beginning in 1987 with the Scarborough rapes.
Scarborough was basically a very safe area. Well-kept single-family homes, just a lovely, lovely neighborhood.
And all of a sudden, there was terror, real terror going on because there's this rapist on the loose, and people lived in fear.
From 1987 to 1990, he struck fear into the hearts of the women of Toronto. He became known as the Scarborough Rapist because the attacks took place in the Scarborough section of East Toronto, 19 assaults in all.
I hate him. He tore my whole life apart. He's the lowest form of life there is.
He would grab women as young as 14, he'd grab them from behind, and he did terrible things.
He'd put a knife to their throat and said, if you look at me, I'll slit your throat.
One of the victims, he had made her beg for her life and plead for her life.
And the attacks, each one got a little bit more violent, as time progressed.
Metropolitan Toronto Police are intensifying their hunt for the man dubbed the Scarborough Rapist. Late Wednesday night, the man attacked what appears to have become his sixth victim.
The sixth victim, he'd beaten her so profusely that he'd fractured her collarbone.
It was just horrifying to hear. Another woman, he stomped on her, her forearm and broke it. And one of his other victims, he wrote on the back, raped by SR, Scarborough Rapist.
This clearly was escalating and escalating rapidly.
Perhaps because he was getting more confident that he wasn't going to get caught.
The cops were really frustrated. They put in long hours, and they just couldn't catch him. And they got the help of the FBI trying to get a profile of the rapist.
The profile could be helpful in understanding the motive of the crime and an offender they were dealing with. He had a need to punish and humiliate and degrade these victims. So there was clear anger at women. And a lot of times this is transferred aggression. They're really angry at someone else in their life, but the victims are taking the brunt of the anger and abuse. We found that the offender was degrading, humiliating, and scripting the victims to engage in self-humiliating verbal behavior, calling themselves sluts and bitches and so forth, but also calling him very complimentary things. He would say, tell me I'm good, tell me you love me, tell me I'm better than your boyfriend. He would rush them, slam them down off the sidewalk into shrubbery, typically, force them down, and then immediately begin to attack. The amount of force was excessive. He used more than was necessary to gain or maintain control over the victim. This could easily escalate up to homicide.
The last rape, in fact, was so violent, investigators believed he would kill his next victim.
We're doing the best we can. Hopefully, somebody has an idea who he is.
Serial rapists typically start in an area in which they're very comfortable and familiar. It's low risk for them. They know all the alleyways and the ins and the outs and fences and how to get home. And so we thought that he really lived in Scarborough. This was his hunting ground. Another indication that he lived in the area was his demand that they not look at him. They might recognize him around the neighborhood.
No one had really seen the attacker's face, so the police didn't really have much to go on. But then the attacker made a mistake.
His first dozen victims, he attacked them all from behind. And his 13th victim, lady was walking down the street and he was walking towards her.
He started a conversation with her.
And he started walking with her. And then they got to a dark alley. Then he attacked her. But she was able to see his face.
And she was able to give police a very detailed description.
Victims helped police draw up a composite picture of the rapist. He was blonde and nice looking, they said.
These eyes frightened her when she saw them.
When they did get a police sketch of this Scarborough rapist, it was put on the front page of the news.
And it was so well done that numerous people saw it and called police and said, I know who that is. That's Paul Bernardo.
Several hundred suspects were questioned, including University of Toronto graduate Paul Bernardo, an aspiring accountant.
Paul Bernardo, at the time of the Scarborough rapes, was living at home with his parents in Scarborough, where he had grown up.
When he grew up, he was Boy Scout, and he had blonde hair and blue eyes, and he was very friendly and popular and very sociable and very outgoing, and he delivered newspapers when he was a little kid. And, you know, all the neighbors loved him.
He was a really good-looking boy, and from all accounts, he was a great kid. Growing up, he was smart, and he was polite, kind.
And he went to university where he studied accounting and started to work at a job at Price Waterhouse. Seems like a guy who's going places.
But Paul Bernardo looks like the Scarborough rapist police sketch.
The police called him in for an interview, and he came in willingly. He was very open. He was very at ease. He wasn't nervous. He said, yeah, it sure looks like me, but, you know, it's not me, but it sure as heck looks like me.
They questioned Paul Bernardo about the crimes, and they asked if he would volunteer a DNA sample, and he agreed. Back then, DNA was fairly new. The lab that analyzed DNA didn't have a lot of resources, so they got that sample, and unfortunately, it was put on a shelf with a whole bunch of other samples where it sat for a number of years.
He just didn't seem like the kind of suspect that would do this.
Neighbors suggested he was a dead ringer for the composite, but after interviewing him, police let him go. No one was arrested.
And in the meantime, Paul Bernardo moved to St. Catharines to live with Karla Homolka and her family. As soon as Paul Bernardo moved to St. Catharines, there were no more rapes in Scarborough. Unfortunately, there were other attacks to come.
Welcome back to Very Scary People. In April 1992, police across Ontario were searching for any clues that could lead them to finding 15-year-old Kristen French, who was abducted in broad daylight on her way home from school. Family and friends held candlelight vigils, praying Kristen would be found safe and sound. But for almost 2 weeks, there was no sign of the missing teen.
The agony of the past few days was clearly evident on the faces of Kristen French's family. They say they feel Kristen is still alive.
Kristen French went missing, and it struck fear in our hearts. But there was always that glimmer of hope. There was always the possibility that she will come home alive.
No one knew what happened. We have to find her.
The body of the young woman was found in a ditch in Burlington's North End. The grim discovery was made at 9:45 a.m. by a man searching for scrap metal.
Kristen's body was found in a ditch in Burlington.
Her body was recovered. Her hair had been chopped off. We get the ME report, and we find she'd definitely been violently assaulted.
It was shocking, the finality that you'd never wanted to come true.
Niagara Regional Police went to the home of Doug and Donna French near St. Catharines to notify them about the young victim.
I was just so sure that they'd find her. I was just so sure. And then when we found her, I just kept thinking, why did he have to kill her?
Everybody was just devastated. Now it's like, what can we do to find the people who did this to her? They're still out there. They can do it again. And that was the fear.
Police were searching for clues for Kristen French's abduction and murder. It was reminiscent of an unsolved case that took place nearby the year before. The murder case of Leslie Mahaffey.
It was a dark, scary time. There is something wrong here.
The nightmare for the Mahaffey family began June 14th, 1991, when 14-year-old Leslie disappeared.
No families
should ever have to go through what we've gone through.
Leslie Mahaffey was a 14-year-old girl with lots of friends. She was fun, she was cool, she liked to hang out with her friends.
I met Leslie when I was 14 through mutual friends. She was dating somebody that I knew. She was very quiet. That's the first thing I noticed, was she was very quiet. As time went on, that changed. She had absolutely beautiful golden hair, and she was absolutely gorgeous when she smiled.
She had a very loving mother and father, a very loving brother, and she lived in a nice community in a nice city. Like, Burlington was seen as a very, very safe place.
The night that Leslie disappeared, she had attended a memorial for a young gentleman who was killed in a car accident.
There was a car crash involving 4 teenagers on a road that high school students called Roller Coaster Road. Sadly, all of them died.
And it was a very, very tragic thing to go through, especially considering what was to come.
Hours before she vanished, Leslie had gone to a funeral home to say goodbye to a friend who had been killed in a car crash with 3 other teens.
A bunch of kids from high school had gone to the funeral home that night, and then Leslie went to hang out with the friends after they all left the funeral home. By around 11 o'clock, Leslie realized that she should start walking home because she had a curfew, and she walked with another friend, and they stopped along the way to talk because he was going to be a pallbearer at the funeral the next day, and he was really nervous. And by now, it was well past Leslie's curfew, and she realized she better get home.
And so he walked her home, and it was late at night.
She got home at 2 o'clock in the morning. All the lights were off. She tried all the doors.
Side door was locked, and tried the front door. It was locked as well.
She was not necessarily comfortable waking her parents at that hour. She was concerned about curfew and disturbing them.
And so she came back and said to the friend, "Don't worry, I'll get in." She said goodbye to the friend, I'll see you tomorrow at the funeral. So he left, he looked back. The last time he saw her, she was standing on the driveway in front of her garage. What we found out later was that she left and went to a phone booth and called her friend to say, "I'm locked out, can I come stay at your house?"
Friend said no. So she walked back to her house.
And that was the last anyone heard from her. I think the next morning when the friend called to see where Leslie was, because they were going to go to the funeral together, that people started to realize that she didn't make it home.
That day, I was actually at one of the funerals. I remember my parents coming to me and telling me that a girl was missing. Once I found out who it was, I couldn't believe it. Leslie just disappeared.
She was reported missing by her parents, and there was an investigation.
I think that's when I started to think, uh-oh, something really bad has happened to her.
"14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey went missing on June 15th. She'd been at a funeral home to say goodbye to a friend. Mahaffey disappeared after heading home.
Leslie Mahaffey. She was reported as a missing teen.
Some people just assumed that she had run away.
And everyone had hoped for the best, and then everyone discovered the worst.
Fishermen at Lake Gibson discovered concrete blocks in the lake one Saturday morning, and then each of the blocks contained a body part, and eventually those body parts were identified as belonging to Leslie Mahaffey.
The dismembered remains of 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey were found in a nearby lake. She had disappeared 2 weeks before.
When she was discovered, it was the horror that someone actually took the time to dismember a body, put it in concrete, and dump it in a lake.
The fact that it can happen to somebody that you know is, it's kind of numbing.
And I still was hoping that maybe the police had made a mistake, but it was her.
No one deserves that.
When Leslie Mahaffey's body parts were being discovered in Lake Gibson, not far away, at an elaborate fairy tale wedding, Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka were getting married.
Dear friends, we have come together in the presence of God.
There's all sorts of videos of it. They're looking happy.
They had their wedding ceremony in Niagara-on-the-Lake, which is just a spectacularly beautiful place.
With a horse-drawn carriage, speeches from Paul that indicated he had found the love of his life.
One of her friends said, you know, you're the luckiest person in the world. He's such a great find. You're so lucky.
This beautiful, lavish wedding almost didn't happen because of this tragedy that the Homolka family had suffered 6 months earlier.
Look at the camera.
Tammy was Karla's happy, loving little sister. They spent a lot of holidays together and just quality family time hanging out. It was December 23rd, the night before Christmas Eve.
There is a family party at the house. Alcohol is served, and Karla's younger sister, Tammy, has a lot to drink.
There's video footage of that night because Paul Bernardo was videotaping everything.
Hi, Tam. How you doing?
And there's video footage of him just saying, hey, Tammy, how you feeling? And she's like, oh, I'm seeing double.
What are you drinking there?
Ice. So you can tell she really is feeling pretty woozy. And after the parents go to bed and Lori, the other sister, goes to her room to call her boyfriend, Paul, Karla, and Tammy go to the basement
to watch movies. And while they're watching movies, Tammy passes out.
She starts to throw up. She begins choking on her vomit. They called 911. When the paramedics and the police came to the house, Paul Bernardo was hysterical. He was apparently banging his head against the wall and why is this happening? And unfortunately, Tammy died the next day in hospital.
The officers who attended didn't see anything out of the ordinary except a young teenager who had had too much alcohol and fallen asleep. And it was treated as an accident.
But what was suspicious was she had like burn marks all around her mouth and all here. And I know in talking to one of the officers, he said that just bothered him.
Yet after this tragedy, Karla was very insistent, and so the wedding, they went ahead and they had it.
There was a lot of tension in the Homolka house after Tammy died. In particular because Karla was carrying on with wedding planning as if nothing happened.
Tammy had died and her parents had to pay for the funeral. And Bernardo wanted a very elaborate wedding. And Bernardo said, well, take out another mortgage on your house to pay for a wedding. And that caused a rift right there.
That's not the behavior of a grieving family member. It would seem to occur to most people that maybe you don't celebrate with a lavish wedding when your younger sister has just died, but not to Karla. She was selfish and self-centered, and it was about her.
And at a certain point, I believe her parents had said to her, like, can we tone this down a little bit? The wedding is going to cost a fortune. And Karla wrote to friends and in her diary that she couldn't believe that her parents were not willing to spend all this money on the wedding. You know, Tammy was dead, it's not her fault, and that they had to spend all this money on the funeral. And she was really, really miffed about it. So much so that her and Paul actually moved out before the wedding.
And they moved into a sweet, charming, pink home in Port Dalhousie.
Karla says, I'm going to have this big wedding. I'm going to have it all.
And nothing was going to stand in her way.
These are two people that really cared about what other people thought of them.
They had a fancy wedding and reception in Niagara-on-the-Lake.
And this is the big wedding that Karla has demanded.
And to them, that had the kind of markings of success.
It seemed like they were the perfect couple, the Ken and Barbie, you know, the dream marriage. But in the wedding party, one of the bridesmaids said it felt like I was going to a funeral.
You can't see genuine happiness in their faces.
Her friends just assumed it was just, you know, little nerves and all that on a wedding day. They knew something was wrong, but they just couldn't couldn't put their finger on, what exactly it was.
They are almost mannequin-like. The smiles were fake because they knew this life they were leading was a fraud.
On the day that Karla Homolka and Paul Bernardo get married,
I, Paul, take you, Karla. Be my wife.
On that very day, they discover Leslie Mahaffey's body.
14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey went missing on June 15th. 2 weeks later, her dismembered body parts were found encased in concrete in Lake Gibson.
Learning how to live with the very complicated and unresolved grief when your child is murdered is an unrelenting task.
We were already living in a climate of growing fear and concern.
People were terrified. It all began with the Scarborough rapes.
Since May the 4th, 1987, numerous sexual assaults have been attributed to a man dubbed the Scarborough Rapist.
Leslie Mahaffey was killed, and Kristen French was kidnapped in broad daylight.
She was a beautiful person. She was kind, and she was just very sensitive. And I think, how could anybody destroy that?
Someone awful is out there. We have to find who did this, or more young girls are gonna die.
Everyone began to wonder at that time if there might be a connection.
What are the chances that two girls go missing in a certain time frame? It's a really weird coincidence.
People were starting to get worried that there might be something bigger at play here.
They were bringing in all the resources available to them to get an answer to this.
I think it's important that everybody realize that this danger is out there.
So the question is, were these cases related, yes or no? There were similarities. Both had been physically assaulted, both had been asphyxiated, both had bruising to their bodies, as though someone had been kneeling on their back, maybe using a ligature strangulation or strangling them from behind. The other issue was geography. Geography always plays a role in these cases, and we had sort of two anchor points, Burlington and St. Catharines.
Burlington and St. Catharines are 45 minutes away. Leslie, who had disappeared in Burlington, her remains were discovered in St. Catharines. Kristen, who had lived in St. Catharines, Ontario, her remains were discovered in Burlington.
Actually a few hundred yards from the grave of Leslie Mahaffey.
Which was a weird thing because you could almost see Leslie's gravestone from where Kristen's body was found. So it was clearly some kind of message. I think everyone knew at that point that there was a serial killer on the loose.
Police are not discounting the possibility a serial killer may be at work in the area.
As the investigation continued, I got a call from Vince Bevan, who was in charge of the investigation. He had this unusual request from a TV station who wanted to know if they could be helpful in some way. Could they do a documentary? So I said, let's use this to our advantage. We can communicate with the offender. Because what we know in any of these cases, these high-profile cases, these offenders follow the media.
Greg, if he is watching this program tonight, what do you think he might be experiencing?
Don McLean, he asked me, well, if the offender is watching now, what would you say? I said, if he's listening, I want to tell him you are going to be apprehended.
Just a question of when.
And he was watching.
He lived in a pretty little pink house with his beautiful wife. Who would have ever thought that this man with this beautiful little pink house could be such a monster? Which is probably one of the reasons why he got away with it.
He didn't believe he would ever get caught.
You ever get caught? No, never, never. Why? I'm a deadly innocent guy.
That was the beginning of, his end.
Paul Bernardo is our worst nightmare.
He was able to hide his true personality beneath this glowing face of a blonde-haired blue-eyed boy next door.
Peeping, prowling, looking in windows, watching women undress.
And as he gets away with it and gets away with it, it's not enough anymore.
This is just a stepping stone. This is just the beginning.
Paul is sick, but he never killed anyone until he met Karla.
She was much more heavily involved than she had portrayed early on.
It's like a bullseye. You start at the edges and you move your way into the center. We watched some of the videos.
And I remember letting out this loud gasp because it was just so horrifying.
Everyone knew, of course, that you were listening to the last minutes in the lives of these young women.
Are you in the Christmas cheer? That's all I want to know.
She says, "Here, I'm giving her as a gift to you."
Knowing that she was going to be killed, she started to talk back to him, fighting right until the very end.
She begged Karla to let her go, and Karla wouldn't do it.
It was horrible. Like, it imprinted on your brain forever.
They looked like the nice young couple, and yet behind all of this facade was such awful evil.
After more than a year of trying to solve the murders of Kristen French and Leslie Mahaffey, police were finally closing in on a suspect, a young, good-looking accountant named Paul Bernardo. But the saga was far from over. When the public learned the sordid details of the crimes and who else was involved, it sent shockwaves throughout the country and the world. In part 2 of The Ken and Barbie Killers. I'm Donnie Wahlberg. Thanks for watching. Good night.
Ôi chào cô, chào cô. Hello các bạn, chào mừng các bạn đã quay trở lại với kênh YouTube của mình. Thì ngày hôm nay sẽ review cho các bạn xem một chiếc áo cực kỳ đẹp luôn các bạn ơi. Đó. Ok, thì chiếc áo hôm nay đem đến cho các bạn là một chiếc áo màu đen. Đó, có đã chữ black các bạn ơi. Không phải black các bạn, mà là backyard kitchen and tap dark kit pet canly coi sao. Đó, và ngoài trước của nó cũng để như thế này. Ok, cái áo này thì mình đánh giá khá là cao điểm cho nó luôn ha. Tại vì nó là màu đen mà mình thích. Với lại là áo nó dạng là hai mặt. Có nghĩa hai mặt là sao biệt là ngoài trước của nó có một cái này giống như chang là in lên các bạn. Cái này là in chứ không phải mai. Đó, một cái dạng in như thế này. Và đằng sau của nó thì có cái dòng chữ như thế này. Nên là mình khá thích ha. Rồi, bây giờ chúng ta sẽ đo thử ha. Đo từ cái tay áo bên phải tới cái tay áo bên trái của nó để xem thử nó khỏi bao nhiêu xăng ha. Và chúng ta sẽ đoán xem là nó là size gì nha mọi người. Đó, chờ hôm nay thì nhà mình cúp điện ở đây mình nó khá là hiu hút luôn, cảm giác là hiu và cái chữ của em cảm giác buồn, cảm giác nó cứ buồn nó cứ hiu kiểu tiếp méo thế nào ấy, cảm giác khó chịu lắm cơ. Rồi thôi bây giờ đo đi. Ok, 10 chưa hết 10 nè, 20 40 tào lao rồi đó, lại 20 40 60 80 100. Ok, nó rơi đó tầm khoảng 100 cm. Và chúng ta sẽ đo từ ở dưới đây, từ cái cổ áo của nó này xuống tới cái điểm dưới đây của nó này xem khoảng bao nhiêu cm. 10 gì 20 40 60, nó rơi đó tầm khoảng 60 cm đó các bạn ơi. Đó từ hai cái tay áo 60 cm và cái là ý là cái độ rộng của nó là 60 cm. Gì? Cái độ rộng của nó là 80 cm và cái chiều dài của nó đó là 60 cm thì phải các bạn, mình quên cụ. Mới đo đây cái trong đầu mình suy nghĩ cái gì cái mình quên rồi. Bây giờ sẽ xem size nó là size gì nha. Ok, rồi đây là cái chỗ mà để size nó các bạn ơi. Thì size của nó là mình cũng đang khá là hồi hộp không biết là size gì anh em ạ. Size XL hả? Vải cái trưởng cái áo này size XL em. Cảm giác nhỏ thế này mà size XL là hơi kỳ. Đó. Cảm giác nhỏ lắm luôn ấy, cảm giác nó có bự vô lớn đâu. Nó có bao nhiêu thôi size XL là thấy méo nào anh em nhỉ? Hơi ảo ma Canada thì bằng nhà xí ha. Rồi ok. Riêng về cái độ ảo ma của nó thôi là mình sẽ chấm cho nó 8/10 nha. Ảo với cái trưởng luôn. Rồi bây giờ chúng ta sẽ xem bên trong, vải bên trong của nó ha. Mình cảm giác cái chất vải của nó khá là mềm đó, khá là mỏng luôn. mỏng cực kỳ luôn, nó mỏng hơn tất cả những cái vải khác các bạn. Và ở bên trong của nó thì ở đằng sau của nó là được may bằng một cái lớp cho này dấu đường may vậy. Ở đằng sau là may một lớp dấu đường may ha. Đây ở đằng sau nó như thế này, một cái lớp dấu đường may như thế này đó, các bạn thấy dấu hết luôn, dấu toàn bộ luôn, dấu như thế này, dấu như thế này và dấu như thế này, dấu nó dấu tới cái tay áo luôn các bạn đó, tới cái tay áo cũng vậy thôi, là từ bên đây qua bên đây rồi tới đây và xuống cái tay áo ở dưới đây luôn. Rồi nó sẽ giấu ha, còn mặt trước của nó thì không giấu, mặt trước của nó thì may những đường chỉ thì mình thấy cũng đều. Nói chung là riêng những cái đường chỉ là mình chấm điểm khá cao, tại dần này mình thấy nó đều các bạn. Và nếu mà chấm điểm cho nó luôn á thì mình sẽ cho cái đường may này cho thì đâu khoảng là 9/10 ha. 9/10 là khá là ok rồi các bạn. Và cái chỗ phần những cái tay áo cái thứ này của nó các bạn lại bị lồi chỉ như thế này nè, nên là mình mới cho điểm 9/10 các bạn. Đây các bạn thấy nó khá là bị lồi chỉ ha. Và những cái lồi chỉ như vậy thì mình không thích mấy. Ở nếu mà nó không lồi chỉ thì chắc chắn mình cho nó 10/10 rồi. Do nó bị lồi chỉ nên là mình sẽ trừ nó 1 điểm. Vì vậy nó mới rơi đâu đó 9/10 các bạn, chiếm thôi là 10/10 luôn ha. Rồi. Ok, bây giờ chúng ta sẽ tới mặt trước lại của nó đi. Phần bên trong của nó chỉ có như thế này thôi, không có cái gì đâu. Bên trong của nó cũng vậy, cảm giác hai bên nào cũng lồi chỉ luôn. Bên nào cũng có chỉ lồi như thế này nè. Và mấy cái chỉ lồi vậy thì mình xử lý cũng đơn giản thôi. Chúng ta chỉ cần lấy kéo chúng ta nhấp xong. Rồi ok, giải quyết xong bây giờ cái phần mặt chỉ nè. Rồi lộn máu lại đi, lộn cái áo lại như thế này. Và để xem bên trong của nó có cái chi, có cái chi là có cái gì, có cái gì là có cái chi đó. Ở bên trong máu của nó thì mình thấy cũng đơn giản này, không có cái gì mà kiểu như là màu mè hay là phức tạp quá thôi. Đây, ở bên trong máu của nó như thế này ha. Đó, ở ngoài của nó là ở chỗ này nè các bạn. Thì cái logo này của nó thì như mình đã nói nãy mình, cái logo này của nó thì có để chữ prosecutors/Barbie Killers. Và ngoài sau ở đằng sau của nó thì cũng để y chang vậy luôn. Thì nó cũng y chang cái hình đằng trước luôn các bạn ơi. Nhưng đặc biệt cái là ở mặt đằng trước của nó bự, cái mặt trước của nó thì nó nhỏ, cái mặt sau nó bự hơn. Ở mấy cái kiểu áo như thế này thì mình khá là thích ha. Và chắc chắn size của nó là size XL mọi người, một cái size cực kỳ ảo ma luôn ha. Size ảo thật, cái size này của nó là mình nghĩ size này của nó tầm khoảng size M thôi em ơi. Size M thôi. Bây giờ cho nó căng tí xí thôi là size L. Đó, cho nó căng xí luôn á, là cho size L chứ size XL cái này thì quá là bé, nhỏ cực kỳ luôn, nhỏ xíu vậy nè. Size này mình nghĩ là size M là hợp lý à. Thì cái áo với cái size XL mà với cái đường áo như thế này thì mình đoán á, mấy bạn nào mà tầm có khoảng 50 kg mặc đẹp, 60 kg cái thứ thì mặc hơi bị chặt cái các bạn. Đó, các bạn nào mà tầm khoảng 50 kg thì có thể mặc được những chiếc áo như thế này nha. Mình nhìn nó cũng hơi dơ xí mọi người nha. Đó đúng không? Nhìn cái đường như đây nó hơi dơ xí nè. Và mấy cái đường này mình giải quyết khá là dễ luôn, thì mình chỉ cần giặt thôi. Đó, để cho mà kỹ á, thì các anh em chỉ cần giặt tay thôi là bảo đảm các bạn giặt tay xong là nhìn sẽ đẹp, nó mới rất là nhiều ha. Còn các bạn giặt bằng máy á, thì nó xấu hơn. Có giặt tay thì nó sẽ đẹp hơn ha. Rồi thì mình sẽ cho nó rơi đó tầm có khoảng là 10/10 điểm. Còn các bạn cho bao nhiêu điểm thì các bạn có thể comment bên dưới cho mình biết nha. Riêng mình bây giờ mình cho nó 10/10 điểm, có nghĩa là mình đang ủng hộ nó các bạn. Đó, tại vì nó khá là đẹp và nó có hai mặt nên mình cho thế thì hợp lý rồi. Mặc dù là hai mặt của nó thì không phải là cái mặt nào, mặc dù là hai mặt của nó mình thừa biết là hai mặt của nó không có gì đặc biệt hết, nhưng mà những cái áo như thế này đơn giản vậy á, mấy cái đơn giản vậy nó đẹp, mà màu mè quá thì các bạn biết rồi đó. Đôi lúc không phải những cái chiếc áo nào màu mè quá là chiếc áo nó sẽ đẹp, chỉ cần đơn giản thế này thôi thì nó sẽ chỉ cần nó đơn giản như này thôi là nó cũng đã đẹp rồi, không cần phải màu mè hoa lá hẹ lắm đâu. Như thế này thôi là xứng đáng có điểm, chỉ cần như thế này thôi ha. Rồi ok, thì do nó đẹp như thế này nên là mình mới cho nó 10/10. Còn các bạn cho bao nhiêu điểm các bạn có thể comment nha. Và chiếc áo này thì chắc chắn mình sẽ đặt tên cho nó là chiếc áo màu đen. Chiếc áo màu đen có hình gì đó, mình đặt nó cái hình này giống hình một cái nồi các bạn. Mình có nên đặt cho nó là chiếc áo màu đen có hình nồi chữ không, hay là chữ nồi hay nồi chữ, khá là khó để mà mình có thể đặt tên cho nó. Rồi ok, riêng về phần đặt tên đó thì mình nhờ các bạn nha, các bạn hãy suy nghĩ cho nó một cái tên, và nếu cái tên nào hay nhất là mình sẽ đặt tên cho nó là cái tên đó ha mọi người. Rồi ok, thì mình sẽ đặt đỡ cho nó chiếc áo hình cái nồi có chữ đi. Rồi video review chiếc áo hình có nồi có chữ của mình đến đây là kết thúc. Hẹn gặp tất cả các bạn vào những video sau. Các bạn xem video của mình đừng quên để lại cho mình một like, một subscribe, đăng ký kênh, và các bạn đừng có quên là ấn vào cái chuông thông báo nha, để mỗi khi mình ra video mới thì nó sẽ thông báo cho tất cả các bạn luôn. Dạ, Còn bây giờ thì mình xin chào tạm biệt tất cả các bạn và hẹn gặp lại tất cả các bạn vào những video sau của mình nha. Bye bye anh em nha. Bye bye mọi người.